Chapter 2. A New Trade in Slaves. Africa Plundered. In the European Middle Ages, the Roman pattern of slavery came to an end, although other forms of servitude, such as serfdom, were common. Towards the end of this period, European explorers began to discover and conquer new lands in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. In 1492, the explorer Christopher Columbus, in the service of Spain, sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, beginning a period of European exploration and settlement in the Americas. These territories offered raw materials, land, and new trading opportunities. They could be developed at little expense by using slave labor. As early as the 1440s, Portuguese seafarers were shipping African slaves back to Portugal and its overseas colonies. European colonists who settled in the Americas first enslaved Native Americans, but as the number of these were decimated by warfare and disease, the colonists seized Africans to take their place. This was a religious age, but Judaism, Christianity, and Islam did not forbid slavery on moral grounds. The scriptures of all three religions included both support for slavery and either some criticism of it, or at least calls for the humane treatment of slaves. Most religions permitted the enslavement of people with other religions' beliefs. For centuries, Muslims along the North African, Barbary coast enslaved European Christians and vice versa. Slavery has existed in Africa long before the coming of the Europeans. As elsewhere in the world, prisoners of war, debtors, or criminals might be enslaved. However, they were not regarded as chattels or personal property, but rather as indentured laborers. They could often regain their freedom after a fixed term. During the Middle Ages, this African slave trade became part of an international trading network. Slaves from sub-Saharan Africa were sold to traders and taken northwards across the desert. In East Africa, slaves were sold to Arab traders along the coast and then shipped to the lands of Southwest Asia. The East African slave trade predated and outlasted that of West Africa. On the West African coast, increasing numbers of English, French, Danish, and Dutch seafarers purchased slaves and shipped them across the ocean to homes and plantations in the New World, as they called the Americas. It had been estimated that about 12 million Africans were uprooted from their homeland and sent to the Americas during the duration of this transatlantic slave trade. Across the Atlantic. The shipment of slaves across the Atlantic developed into a three-way operation, the triangular trade. On the outward voyage, ships from Europe brought iron, copper, textile, beads, firearms, and liquor to West African ports. These were then traded for slaves, which were shipped to the Americas on the second leg of the voyage, the infamous Middle Passage. For the last leg of the voyage, returning to Europe, the ships took on sugar, molasses, syrup drained from raw sugar, rum, tobacco, indigo, a deep blue dye made from a shrub grown in South America and the Caribbean, cotton, and other New World exports. Where did the slaves come from? Since ancient times, West Africa has been ruled by a succession of powerful chiefdoms, kingdoms, and empires under which slavery was common. One ruler of Mali in the 13th, Manu Musa, traveled to Arabia accompanied by 12,000 personal slaves. In the 60s and 70s, the export of slaves as well as the taxation of foreign traders brought wealth to African rulers and merchants. In West Africa, the European newcomers rarely seized the slaves for themselves. They left that to local raiders, who would attack villages and kidnap men, women, and children. All were marched to the coast, being relayed from one trader to another. That terrified survivors were then locked up in pens or coastal forts until they were sold to the Europeans. The voyage across the Atlantic was an unimaginable horror. Millions of slaves died before ever seeing the Americas. They were often branded like cattle, fettered and packed into the dark, stinking hold, seasick and wretched. In the 18th century, the voyage lasted about 12 weeks. Many caught diseases such as dysentery, scurvy, or smallpox. Those able to put up resistance to their captors were flogged, tortured, or thrown overboard. So, too, were those whose spirits sank so low that they became listless and weak. Some committed suicide. Northern Europeans, such as the British, Danish, and French, soon led the slave trade, which at first had been dominated by the Portuguese and Spanish. Those who profited from slavery included plantation owners and sugar brokers. Seaports such as Bristol and Liverpool in England, and Nantes, La Rochelle, and Lorient in France became rich from the slave trade.